President Trump signed an executive order to designate the Antifa movement as a domestic terrorist organization. The order directs the federal government to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle any and all illegal operations conducted by Antifa or any person claiming to act on behalf of Antifa. It also calls for investigation into and actions against the funding sources behind their operations. Now, given the unique makeup of Antifa, what could this move by the president actually accomplish? Joining me now to talk about this is Kyle Shideler. He's the director and senior analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security Policy. He is also editor of Unmasking Antifa: 5 Perspectives on a Growing Threat. Kyle, welcome to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So before we get into the mechanics of this, let's talk a little bit about Antifa. You know, we hear a lot about it, especially back, after the George Floyd incident, but it's not like a typical organization or even a movement. Give us the background.
Well, Antifa is made up of a series of autonomous cells, or what they would describe as affinity groups. These affinity groups come together to conduct direct actions, which can be everything from sabotage and violence to protesting, rioting, and the like. But they are not organized from the typical top-down hierarchical structure that we typically think of if you think about like a mafia kingpin or something like that. They're organized from the bottom up in these smaller structures. But they then connect these structures in a variety of different ways, including city chapters, regional networks, international networks, and the like. So they are actually heavily organized. They're highly organized. They are just organized in a very deliberate, explicitly anarchist approach.
So isn't this asymmetrical organization? I mean, this is kind of like the terrorist cells operate.
Yeah, quite so. Yeah, absolutely. Or sometimes I'll give the example to law enforcement when I'm briefing them of a description of like an outlaw motorcycle club or a street gang, where you have individual groups of people who are well known to each other, who work closely together, and they then have relationships with other groups, and they derive benefits from that larger connection and from the name recognition of the brand. And it was actually in 2007 an Antifa manual, a forming Antifa group manual that was printed online. And one of the things they said was, if you identify as Antifa, you carry certain obligations to the larger group and the larger movement. And so they have ways of determining connections and relationships through that sense of obligation that is created.
So how will the government go about going after their resources and their organizational structure? I mean, given what you've just described, how can they go about taking down this domestic terrorist organization?
Well, I think it's worth recognizing that there is technically no domestic terrorism organization list or designation that doesn't have any statutory authority. But what I think the president is indicating with this executive order is that he really intends a whole of government approach. He expects to see every law enforcement agency and national security agency playing its part to address what he sees as a threat to the national security of the United States, and quite rightly, in my view. So certainly my hope is that they will take a whole of government approach, that we will see federal law enforcement utilizing all manner of counterterrorism authorities, but that they'll also look at certain white-collar crime authorities, racketeering statutes, that they'll look at things like utilizing charity fraud to take on some of these community organizations and bail funds that help support rioters and get them out of jail. That they'll do things like, for example, utilize counterintelligence capabilities and authorities to target the connections between some of these organizations and foreign adversaries who operate abroad. There are a number of examples of ties to far-left terrorist groups, for example.
I want to ask you about that, because while there's no domestic terrorist organization authority statute dealing with that, if they're connected internationally with these, I don't know, we would use the term terrorists, but there's groups that are find their way onto our international list. Would that be enough of a connection to use statutory authority to go after them?
I think so. There are certainly a number of explicitly named Antifa groups that have conducted attacks overseas in some of our allied countries and even crossed international borders to conduct attacks against things like politicians and the like. So I think you could build the case for designating some of those Antifa groups abroad and then backtrack to those connections that they have to international Antifa networks and then in turn to domestic Antifa networks. So I think with a little bit of work and investigative effort, you could put together a designation structure that would eventually have U.S.-based Antifa groups designated under a foreign terrorism organization designation. But I recognize that it would be a challenge. The State Department would have to put some work in to make it happen, but I think it would technically be lawful.
We just got about 25 seconds left. Funding, where do they get their money?
Well, most Antifa work is not that expensive, to be honest with you. They crowdfund a lot of it. They engage in all manner of community projects. Everything you can think of to do to raise money, they'll do. Book fairs, bake sales, and the like. But most of their larger expenses are bail money and transportation, and those tend to get provided by larger fiscal sponsor 501c3 organizations, some of which do have connections to progressive foundations.
All right, Kyle, thanks so much for joining us.